Roger Waters.
Making a record is a good social activity as well as being interesting work, and it's good to have a structure that isn't completely hierarchical in the studio, so that we can all have a laugh as well as doing the work. I actually record from 11 in the morning till 6 or 7 in the evening. You know, that's 8 hours, and if it's not fun, you should be doing something else, really.
Roger must be having fun. He has continued to record ever since 1967's The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, Pink Floyd's debut. However, Roger's latest album, Amused to Death, is not about fun.
It's a record about how the free market is destroying the world and how television can either save us or kill us quicker.
This is Roger's third solo effort. In it, he maintains the vital energy that typified his previous solo work and his time with the legendary Floyd. I'm Dan Neer. Welcome to part 1 of Media America Radio's presentation of Roger Waters. Up Close. In his career, Roger Waters has album credits as songwriter, producer, arranger, bassist, guitarist, singer, and as playing, quote, the odd keyboard, unquote.
I think the two most important categories are the songwriting and the record production. I've always had very strong ideas about how to make records, and I've developed my own style. And the songwriting is the key, really. There's a million singers in the world, but there aren't all that many people who can write songs.
And there aren't that many people who can write songs that create controversy.
I've had quite a lot of reaction from people who didn't like What God Wants Part 1 when it came out because they thought it was sacrilegious, which I knew they would, a number of them. One or two letters I've got from people, though, show that they get it, even though they might be God-fearing Christians. They nevertheless have got the point, and that I'm not attacking their God or anybody else's. I'm attacking the use that the powers that be make of our religious preferences in order to pit us one against the other.
Both of the first two songs you just heard featured Jeff Beck's guitar work.
I remember sitting on a train with Sid going up to London once to go to a rock and roll show.
That train ride took place back in the 1950s, and Sid was no other than Syd Barrett, who later joined Roger in Pink Floyd.
We sat with a paper and a pencil and drew out the way we would be on stage and drew out the equipment. And I remember it was all going to be done with 3 AC-30s, Vox AC-30s, one for the bass, one for the vocals and rhythm instruments, and one for lead guitar and something else I can't remember. And so our intentions were no more serious than that, than the intentions of all, 15, 16, 17-year-olds who decide to start bands. Or certainly in those days, I'm talking about, the late 50s. It wasn't until 2 or 3 years after that, I'd been in London for a year at architecture school, and Sid came up to go to Camberwell Art School to study fine arts and painting. And it wasn't until then that the group really came together. We were called the Pink Floyd Sound for some time, and then it got reduced to Pink Floyd, and as is well documented, it's two halves of the names of two sidemen on a blues anthology album who were called Floyd Council and Pink Anderson. Because by that time we were playing lots and lots of blues. Our repertoire consisted almost entirely of Elmore James and Lightning Hopkins, and we were playing nearly all blues and rhythm and blues. And then Sid started to write songs, and that's when it all changed. He was slipping fast into a black pit that is schizophrenia. He brought his kind of energy and a extraordinary writing skill. He wrote in a very, very English and whimsical, but quite perceptive as well, way, particularly when his pain was mixed with the kind of whimsy of a certain slice of English literature. I thought the songs that came out were very moving. particularly the later ones when there was a bit more pain and a bit less whimsy. He was already mildly schizophrenic at this point. He was slipping fast into that black pit.
Because of this, a second guitarist, Dave Gilmour, was brought in to help. It wasn't long before Sid's condition took him out of the band, as Roger, Dave, Nick Mason, and Rick Wright carried on. Through 1972, Pink Floyd's highest album chart position was number 46, which they hit with Obscured by Clouds. Then, in 1973, the clouds parted and the dark side of the moon shone through. The Floyd's most popular album shot to number 1. Here's Roger Waters.
It was quite a powerful piece of work and quite moving. And so I wasn't all that surprised when people responded to it, because its power is kind of insidious. It's kind of half easy listening and half hard hitting. So you get it's a very seductive sounding record, but it's about something, and maybe that's why it's endured.
That's a bit of an understatement. The Dark Side of the Moon spent over 10 years on the Billboard album charts.
The only reason it's not on the charts anymore is because they changed the rules. Billboard introduced a rule which said no album that's been out for more than 10 years is allowed to appear in the 200, because the business decided that the chart is a selling tool, and they don't need that tool to sell Dark Side of the Moon or Hotel California or the other classic albums. So they thought, well, let's make a separate chart for those and not allow them to have space on the real chart, because those albums would all still be there.
Hi, I'm Dan Neer. Welcome back to part 1 of Roger Waters' Up Close.
We're living on a small planet with an ever-diminishing resource, and I align myself philosophically and politically with the Green Movement and with that stuff, which, thank God, is gathering power and force. And there are more and more fellow travellers down that line. Communism, if you like, was, in my view, was a reasonable experiment which came unstuck because it denied the freedom of the individual, in the same way that a free market economy denies the freedom of the individual. I mean, there's freedom and freedom. You know, there's one freedom for me, and there's another freedom for the guy who's pushing his shopping cart down Sunset Boulevard, or the hooker across the street. You know, sure, we're both free. You know, but are we? And also, a free market predisposes us to the idea that competition is good, and when you have a competition you have a winner and a loser, and how free's the loser? And the losers are maybe, you know, in Ethiopia starving to death, or wherever in the third world or in the southern hemisphere. We may in the West may feel that this situation is kind of okay because we're the winners by and large.
Roger stresses those views strongly on his latest album, Amused to Death. They're not new. Here's a similar theme from 20 years ago. Roger Waters' latest album is called Amused to Death, and as we said before, it's not very funny.
It's a record about how the free market is destroying the world and how television can either save us or kill us quicker. A number of the songs were inspired by and or written around stuff that I saw on television. There's, as we all know, a very insidious trend in television for it to become about nothing but making money. News programs, for instance, are still pretending to be news programs, but they're nothing of the kind. They're actually propaganda and light entertainment by and large. So the more salacious and sensational the piece of news, the more likely it is to get onto the television screens, because the news programs, because they're fighting for ratings, find it necessary that their prime target is to entertain their viewing audience rather than to inform them. And with the Turner thing at CNN, it's now spreading globally, which is even more dangerous, because as you cross international borders, then the propaganda factor becomes more important, as it becomes a tool to propagate the foreign policies of any particular power. In the case of CNN, the United States of America.
Here's Roger.
I think my writing is helped by the fact that I have no particular virtuoso technique on any instrument. And I've made it my business as well to steer clear of knowing too much about the theory of music. because the more you know about the rules, I think the harder it is to break them.
Part 1 of Roger Waters Up Close was produced in New York by Near Perfect Productions as an exclusive presentation of Media America Radio. The producers are David Bales and James Fahey, assisted by Sal Cerencioni. The executive producers are DeWitt Nelson and me, Dan Neer. Up Close is distributed on compact disc and copyrighted 1993, all rights reserved. No portion may be used without the written permission of the producers. Join us next time on this radio station for Part 2 of Roger Waters Up Close. Thanks for listening. In 1965, Roger Waters co-founded Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett, Nick Mason, and Rick Wright. Early recordings sounded like this. In 1984, Roger moved on from Floyd to a solo career where he discovered the pros and cons of hitchhiking.
To step out from under the protection of the umbrella that trademark is, that the name Pink Floyd is, was felt quite kind of dangerous, but the reasons for leaving so far outweighed any reasons in fact, there was only one reason for staying in, and that would have been, for economic security. Well, I had that already.
And now today, we find Roger amused to death. Hi, I'm Dan Neer, and you've tuned in to the right show at the right time. Welcome to Part 2 of Media America Radio's presentation of Roger Waters Up Close. The anti-war theme of that song is repeated throughout that album. For a variation, listen to Late Home Tonight, Part 1. Here's Roger.
You cannot fly an aeroplane over enemy airspace and drop bombs on civilians without having developed the capacity to disassociate yourself from their feelings. Right. Maybe the beauty of military life, as I see it, and as I expect, and obviously I'm being sarcastic when I'm in these lyrics, is that you become inviolate because the nature of the acts that you're prepared to commit says that you don't give a shit about these people, and if they have to die in the most horrific and horrendous way, well, so be it. Unlucky, but you're not prepared to even consider getting involved in the decision-making process about that, because if you were, you wouldn't be a pilot. They tell you to drop the bomb, you do it. It doesn't matter whatever happens. We come back to Stanley Kubrick. It's the Dr. Strangelove thing.
Now that Roger Waters has released that album, his fourth post-Pink Floyd work, he can look back on the material he created in Floyd with some perspective.
The body of work that we made in Pink Floyd, I'm really proud of a lot of it. And so I'm glad people are still interested in it and still buy the records, and that there's a certain kind of reverence towards some of it.
One of the most revered of Pink Floyd's albums is The Dark Side of the Moon. David Gilmour and Nick Mason take us back to that era.
Gradually all came together. Roger wrote a lot of good lyrics. We put it all together, and then we actually went out and performed it. We actually toured it around the world, America and everywhere, under a different name. It was called Eclipse originally. Before we ever recorded it, and I think we developed it a little bit. Developed a bit. I think the development and the actual knowing how to play it very well, from having done concerts of it around the world, was quite a big factor in the recording of it being good, and getting rid of a lot of dead wood and
It's a good system for making records, really, but of course it's now entirely obsolete because of bootlegging. There's no way you dream of doing anything like that now.
Part 2 of Roger Waters Up Close returns with Roger reflecting on the incredible success of The Dark Side of the Moon and how Pink Floyd followed it up.
Well, you can't do it again. I mean, it very rarely happens twice. However, Wish You Were Here was an interesting process, because the band was having achieved what it was meant to achieve in Dark Side of the Moon. It was an interesting period after that. And Wish You Were Here, I think, was a record about it's all about absence, and it's specifically about the absences that develop in the wake of the kind of success that we had with Dark Side of the Moon. You know, you inevitably people drift apart at that point, no longer bound by, you know, a common goal.
The sessions for Wish You Were Here were haunted by the presence of a still very disturbed Syd Barrett. Nick Mason and Dave Gilmour pick up the tale.
Well, it was slightly grim in a way, because yes, he turned up, and I mean, I, for one, certainly didn't recognise him.
He was there. The guy was just wandering around the studio for like 2 or 3 hours, and no one actually recognised him at all.
Just over a year later, a menagerie was conceived, and Animals hit number 3. Here's Roger.
At the end of the Animals tour, which was the only stadium tour that I ever did, my disgust at that form had mounted to the point where in the Olympic Stadium in Montreal I found myself spitting at some kid in the crowd, and I was very upset by the whole experience of touring in stadiums. I found it very alienating and upsetting. And at that point I felt, God, I've reached a serious low point here, and I realised I was completely alienated from the audience, and the notion popped into my mind to express that feeling by doing a rock and roll show where at the beginning it was just a band on a stage, and then as the show progressed we physically build a wall across the front of the stage until the band are separated physically and actually from the audience in the way that I felt we were anyway during the Animals tour. And at the end of the show would be the last brick being put into the wall, and Goodnight Irene. And so I worked on it. We were actually in LA doing overdubs, vocal overdubs, and the last bits of production on the record. And I just thought it would be a really good sound, you know, but that derived specifically from the lyric. In fact, the man who recorded it is sitting behind me right now, Nick Griffiths. And so we sent him a multi-track of Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. And the school happened to be round the corner from the studio that we owned at the time. And he went and saw the headmistress, and she sent some kids round, and he did it, and then sent us the tapes back. It worked out incredibly well. I remember the tape coming back, and I put it up on the machine in Producer's Workshop and just pushed all the faders up and pressed play. And so the sound came out not mixed, not treated, not anything, but it just screamed hit record.
That album struck gold and then platinum and held on to number 1 for 15 weeks. The most successful use of The Wall came in 1990. Roger Waters performed it with his Bleeding Heart Band and a host of special guests, including the Scorpions, the band, Joni Mitchell, Thomas Dolby, Sinead O'Connor, Albert Finney, and Marianne Faithfull.
Well, a guy called Mick Werwood, who got involved with Leonard Cheshire's Memorial Fund for Disaster Relief, and they were looking for an event of some sort to publicise the Memorial Fund. So they approached me and said, would you be prepared to put the wall on in Berlin? Or to put the wall on for us, not in Berlin. And I was I confess, rather sceptical about the whole idea. Eventually I agreed, and we started looking at venues. They had lots of contacts in Russia, so for a while there was talk of going to do it in Red Square, and then we thought about doing it in Wall Street. And then November 1989 came round, and all that stuff happened in Eastern Europe, and so we flew to Berlin the next day, and we saw the piece of ground that eventually we did the show on. And after that it was all politics, and to get the permission to perform on this piece of ground that actually straddled the border between East and West. And it was very hard work and very difficult, both politically and logistically. But we did it, and I'm glad we did at the end of the day.
The Tide is Turning after Live Aid, performed by the ensemble cast at the Performance of the Wall in Berlin in 1990. The performance was a benefit for the World Memorial Fund for Disaster Relief. The work of that organization is not over, and neither is your chance to help. Here's Roger.
It would be fantastic if people who didn't buy the album at the time buy it now, or the video, because I looked at the video again the other night, and it's a most extraordinary document whether you like my work or not, then the Memorial Fund gets all the royalties, not just the artist royalties, but the publishing mechanicals and everything from all of it. And they need all the support they can get.
Here's the address to contact. The World Memorial Fund for Disaster Relief, 3 Throgmorton Avenue, London, EC24 2WW, England. We'll give that address again at the end of Part 2 of Roger Waters Up Close, so if you didn't get it, grab a pad and a pen. Right now, we'll take a pause for the cause, and then we'll be right back.
The show must go on.
Up Close returns. With Pink Floyd long behind him, Roger has been charting the sometimes treacherous solo waters for some time now. However, making the break was easy.
It was an enormous relief. I mean, to step out from under that protection of the umbrella that trademark is, that the name Pink Floyd is, was felt quite kind of dangerous. But the reasons for leaving so far outweighed any reasons. In fact, there was only one reason for staying in, and that would have been, for economic security. Well, I had that already. There had been so much wrangling and bickering and bad blood being created steadily since 1975. It was nearly 10 years. And although we produced some very good work in that 10 years, it became increasingly my thing. I was writing all the material and doing most of the work on producing the records, and it became very uncomfortable for everybody. It becomes very one-sided, and once a group stops being a group, then the grown-up thing is to disband it and to go off on our separate ways. I see light at the end of the tunnel. The information that we're getting about the fact that the globe is a system of dwindling resource and so on and so forth is certainly has changed an awful lot in the last 25 years in terms of people's attitudes, and the burgeoning and blossoming of the green movements and so on and so forth I find really encouraging.
Let's take this opportunity to make another pitch for the World Memorial Fund. Roger Waters' The Wall Live in Berlin is the name of the album. Contributions and requests for paraphernalia from the historic event can be sent to the World Memorial Fund for Disaster Relief, 3 Throgmorton Avenue, London, EC24 2WW, England. We'd like to thank Jim Del Balzo, Paul Rappaport, Jenny Drozd, and Tom Aaron of Columbia Records, Mark Fennick of EG Music Group Limited, and Nick Griffiths. Part 2 of Roger Waters Up Close was produced in New York by Near Perfect Productions as an exclusive presentation of Media America Radio. The producers are David Bales and James Fahey, assisted by Sal Cirencioni. The executive producers are DeWitt Nelson and me, Dan Neer. Up Close is distributed on compact disc and copyrighted 1993, all rights reserved. No portion may be used without the written permission of the producers. Join us next time on this radio station as we get up close with your favorite rockers. Thanks for listening.